They were killing as many as 5 and 6 people a day. Signs hanging around the neck of the body signed Los Pepes.
And came in later and said, they got him. He's been killed. He was shot on a rooftop.
In 1993, Pablo Escobar, the world's most infamous drug lord,
The manhunt is underway in Colombia for escaped drug kingpin Pablo Escobar.
was gunned down on a Medellín rooftop, or so the official story goes.
Shooting Escobar dead in a hail of gunfire on a Medellín rooftop.
Newly declassified files reveal a far darker tale, one written not by police or soldiers, but by a ruthless shadow army called Los Pepes.
Los Pepes were tremendously effective, and I think they were key in isolating Escobar fairly rapidly.
From mutilated bodies left as warnings to covert CIA involvement and devastating betrayals,
If you want to be the king, you know, sometimes the king has to pick up the phone and drop bombs on people.
this is the chilling truth behind Escobar's fall, a story that will haunt you long after it's told. Who were Los Pepes? The bloody genesis.
Pablo was the CEO. 80% of the cocaine was being sent by Pablo Escobar in the Medellín cartel.
History has this tricky habit of telling stories with missing pages. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's deliberate, but either way, the passage of time erodes details, leaving us with half-truths and distorted legends. Few figures illustrate this better than Pablo Escobar, the infamous Colombian drug lord whose life was as complicated as it was violent. To some, Escobar was nothing short of a monster, a ruthless narco-terrorist who plunged Colombia into chaos. This was the man who unleashed car bombs in city streets, assassinated judges, politicians, and journalists, and essentially declared war on the state itself.
Pablo Escobar declares war on the entire Colombian state and his old friends, the Cali cartel.
His philosophy was summed up by his chilling motto, plata o plomo, silver or lead. In other words, take the bribe or take a bullet. But to others, especially among Colombia's poor, Escobar was seen as a modern-day Robin Hood. He built houses, soccer fields, schools, and even entire neighborhoods for those who had been long ignored by the government. His generosity earned him a cult-like following, especially in Medellín, where many saw him not as a drug lord, but as a savior who cared when no one else did. The truth? Escobar was both. A man who could order a brutal assassination in the morning and hand out food to hungry families in the afternoon. It's this duality that made him both revered and hated. And ultimately, it was this mountain of enemies, some hidden, some in plain sight, that would lead to his downfall. You've probably heard the saying, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Well, that's exactly how Los Pepes came into being. By the early 1990s, Pablo Escobar wasn't just a drug kingpin. He was a problem for everyone. Buzzwords like cartel and narco-terrorism entered the world's collective lexicon at the height of cocaine's violent era in the 1980s. A series of crucial turning points gave rise to this new reality. His rivals were furious at his growing power, politicians feared for their lives, and former allies who had turned against him were living in constant terror. The tipping point came in 1992, when Escobar pulled off one of the most audacious moves of his career. He escaped from La Catedral, his luxury prison fortress. With Escobar now free and back on the streets, Colombia descended into chaos. That's when a coalition of enemies decided they had had enough.
Presidential candidate Luis Galán makes it clear if he is elected, Escobar will be on the first plane out of Colombia.
They united under the name Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, translated as People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar. And just like that, Los Pepes were born. But don't let the name fool you. Los Pepes weren't a bunch of innocent victims seeking justice. They were a terrifying vigilante group made up of some of the most dangerous players in the game. Former Medellín cartel members who defected and wanted revenge. The Cali cartel, secretly pumping money into Los Pepes while pretending to stay out of the mess. Right-wing paramilitaries, bringing military tactics and discipline to the group. And perhaps most chillingly, relatives of Escobar's victims, fueled by pure vengeance. One of the group's key leaders was Fidel Castaño, a paramilitary commander whose family would later go on to form Colombia's notorious paramilitary networks. Fidel Castaño, a rival drug lord who was, perhaps, even more brutal than Escobar himself. Castaño's breaking point came when Escobar murdered two prominent members of his cartel.
The Rodriguez brothers have helped eliminate Colombia's most brazen enemy and their most ferocious rival,
Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada, as they visited Escobar at La Catedral. Castaño was scheduled to be at that meeting, but he declined to go. From the very beginning, Los Pepes made their mission clear: destroy Pablo Escobar and everyone connected to him. And they didn't play by the rules. Their early operations were straight out of a nightmare. Mutilated bodies began showing up in Medellín, each accompanied by a note signed simply, Los Pepes. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal, sending a clear message that no one loyal to Escobar was safe. But they didn't stop at assassinations. Los Pepes systematically obliterated Escobar's empire, going after his safe houses, warehouses, drug labs, and money laundering fronts. They were dismantling his business, ripping out the roots Pablo had worked so hard to plant. Their attacks weren't limited to soldiers and gangsters either. If you were connected to Escobar in any way, even as a lawyer or accountant, you were fair game. Family members weren't off limits either. In one infamous act, Los Pepes destroyed 2 haciendas belonging to Escobar's mother, Hermilda Gaviria, a clear warning that nowhere and no one was untouchable. And then there were the explosives. Car bombs, grenades, and improvised devices turned Medellín into a war zone. Los Pepes were simply trying to erase everything linked to Pablo Escobar, including his legacy. But what made Los Pepes truly dangerous wasn't just their brutality, it was the invisible hand guiding them. So, what invisible hand guided these outlaws dishing out justice? It's none other than the Colombia government itself, the CIA and Colombian government's Shadow Alliance.
Illegal cocaine is coming into our country at alarming levels.
It's especially damaging to the young people on whom our future depends.
When it comes to Pablo Escobar's downfall, the headlines tend to focus on the rooftop chase in Medellín, the dramatic end of the world's most notorious drug lord. But behind that cinematic finale was a shadowy web of alliances, betrayals, and dirty deals that never made it to the evening news. Because the truth is, Escobar wasn't brought down by law enforcement alone. There's a saying in spycraft, sometimes, to fight monsters, you have to build a bigger monster. And in the case of Escobar, that bigger monster was Los Pepes, a vigilante death squad that didn't just have the backing of rival cartels, but, as declassified files later suggested, connections to both the Colombian government and the CIA. Yeah, you heard that right. The United States government may have indirectly helped arm and empower a group whose methods were as bloody as Escobar's own. Fast forward to 2008, a once classified U.S. intelligence report comes to light, and it drops a bombshell. The CIA had been in contact with Fidel Castaño, the feared paramilitary leader at the heart of Los Pepes. According to the report, the CIA didn't just know about Los Pepes. They actively maintained contact for the purposes of intelligence collection. In other words, they were watching, listening, and at the very least, not stopping what was happening. So, why would the United States care so much about one Colombian drug lord? The simple answer is that Escobar had become too powerful to ignore. By the early 1990s, his empire was smuggling cocaine into the United States by the ton, and also destabilizing Colombia itself. Politicians were either bought or killed. Judges lived in constant fear. And Escobar's car bomb campaigns were turning Medellín into a literal war zone. From Washington's perspective, Escobar had become something of a national security threat. And when something reaches that level of danger, 3 letters tend to show up. CIA. While the CIA was pulling strings in the background, Colombia had its own official force tasked with hunting Escobar, the Search Block. On paper, the Search Block was an elite police unit with one mission: capture or kill Escobar. They were Colombia's public face of justice, giving press conferences and assuring citizens that they operated strictly within the law. But behind closed doors, well, things got a lot murkier. Reports and testimonies later suggested that some members of the Search Block had cozy ties with Los Pepes. While they never admitted to outright collaboration, they seemed more than happy to look the other way, while Los Pepes waged their private war on Escobar. Think of it like this: the Search Block would publicly take credit for striking a blow against Escobar, while in reality, it was Los Pepes doing the dirty work. Assassinations, bombings, intimidation campaigns, all the things the government couldn't be caught doing. This wasn't just passive tolerance either. Allegations surfaced that certain government officials quietly provided Los Pepes with weapons, intelligence, and logistical support, effectively turning them into a shadow extension of state power. If true, that meant Colombia's fight against Escobar wasn't entirely a battle of good versus evil. It was more like evil versus slightly less evil. Here's the thing. By 1992, Escobar had his tentacles everywhere. He had bought off politicians, bribed judges, and corrupted entire police departments. His reach was so vast that a straightforward legal takedown was basically impossible. Anyone who stood against him risked being assassinated, and even the bravest cops couldn't always trust the person standing next to them. So what do you do when your enemy has infiltrated your entire system? You bring in outsiders. For the Colombian government, that meant quietly leaning on groups outside the law, like Los Pepes, to do what official forces couldn't. For the CIA and DEA, it meant sharing intelligence under the table, feeding information about Escobar's movements and operations to the very people willing to use extreme violence to dismantle his empire. The US wasn't directly ordering hits or planting bombs, at least not according to the documents that were later revealed, but by providing intel and support, they were nudging events along, ensuring that Los Pepes always seemed to be one step ahead of Escobar. From their perspective, the calculus was simple. Escobar's Medellín cartel was the single greatest threat to stability in the region. If taking him down meant empowering a group like Los Pepes, well, that was a risk they were willing to take. Armed with inside information and protected by powerful allies, Los Pepes launched a campaign of psychological warfare unlike anything Escobar had ever faced, and he shook. Terror tactics. Escobar's family and allies targeted. If there's one thing Pablo Escobar would later understand, it was fear. For years, he had been the master of terror, the man who made judges resign overnight, politicians flee their homes, and journalists whisper his name like a curse. He had built an empire where loyalty was bought and betrayal was punished by death. But in the final chapter of his reign, the tables turned. Suddenly, Escobar himself was the one being hunted, and his enemies, Los Pepes, were willing to go to terrifying extremes to bring him down. Their mission wasn't just to destroy Escobar's drug empire. They wanted to break him, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And the quickest way to do that? Go after the people he loved and trusted most. Los Pepes didn't fight fair. From the very start, they targeted Escobar's inner circle, the people who kept his empire running smoothly. His lawyers, accountants, lieutenants, even childhood friends who had grown up alongside him. No one was off limits. Escobar's accountants were especially prized targets. They were the guardians of his billions, the ones who knew where his hidden cash stashes and laundering operations were buried, sometimes literally. One chilling instance was the brutal fate of Fernando Galeano, a Medellín cartel associate who had managed some of Escobar's finances and drug routes. After a dispute over missing funds, Escobar had Galeano and his cousin, Gerardo Moncada, killed inside La Catedral prison while he was still imprisoned there.
Escobar ruled over a kingdom of horror fueled by assassinations, kidnappings, and terror attacks.
This enraged many former allies and gave Los Pepes a rallying cry. Later, Los Pepes systematically hunted down anyone still loyal to Galeano or Moncada, framing it as vengeance, but also using these hits to choke off Escobar's access to money and manpower. Even more horrifying were the kidnappings of accountants and bookkeepers who actively worked for Escobar. These men were abducted in the dead of night, tortured for information on cash reserves and safehouse locations, and then executed, their mutilated bodies left in public with blood-smeared notes signed simply, Los Pepes. Each message was a declaration of psychological war, aimed as much at those still alive as at Escobar himself. For Pablo Escobar, family was sacred. He may have been a ruthless drug lord, but he was also a devoted husband and father. His love for his wife, Maria Victoria, and their children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, was genuine and fierce. And Los Pepes knew exactly how to weaponize that love against him. Escobar's relatives quickly became prime targets. Family homes were burned to ashes. Businesses connected to his siblings and cousins were bombed. And in one especially grotesque act, Los Pepes desecrated the graves of his family members, leaving taunting notes warning that the living would join the dead. These attacks were calculated psychological strikes. By going after his family, Los Pepes weren't simply hurting Escobar, they were undermining his very identity as a protector. Escobar became so paranoid about his children's safety that he moved them constantly, never staying in one safe house for more than a few nights. At one point, his young daughter Manuela became so cold while hiding in the mountains that Escobar famously burned stacks of cash, reportedly over $2 million, just to keep her warm. The relentless pressure even drove Escobar to consider surrendering to authorities again, not out of fear for his own life, but to shield his wife and children from Los Pepes' wrath. For a man who had once defied the entire Colombian government, this was a staggering shift. Los Pepes had a signature move that turned every attack into a public spectacle. Whenever they struck, they'd leave behind blood-stained notes scrawled with messages like, "For Pablo, the next one is you," always signed with their name, Los Pepes. Imagine being one of Escobar's allies and finding a dismembered body with that message pinned to it. It was a constant reminder that these enemies weren't hiding. They wanted everyone to know who was dismantling Escobar's empire, piece by bloody piece. Entire neighborhoods would sometimes awaken to find bodies hanging from lampposts, a medieval-style warning that loyalty to Escobar came with a death sentence. Medellín became a city under siege, not just from Escobar's war with the government, but from this new, invisible enemy that seemed to strike anywhere, anytime. One of Los Pepes' most ruthless campaigns targeted the remnants of Escobar's closest confidant and cousin, Gustavo Gaviria. Gustavo, the Medellín cartel's chief financial strategist, had been killed by police in 1990, but his network of trusted operatives lived on, until Los Pepes began systematically wiping them out. By dismantling Gaviria's financial machine, Los Pepes cut off Escobar's ability to move money and pay his soldiers. It was like cutting off the blood supply to a wounded beast. Without his cousin's loyal associates, Escobar's empire began collapsing at an even faster pace. As the body count rose, Escobar's legendary self-control began to shatter. He had spent years as the predator, the man who dictated life and death with a single command. Now, he was the prey, hunted on all sides and unsure whom to trust. But the deadliest blow to Escobar wasn't violence. It was betrayal from within. The betrayal inside Escobar's inner circle. Pablo Escobar had always believed his greatest strength was loyalty. For years, his inner circle had been a tight-knit group of family, childhood friends, and lieutenants who would kill or die for him. Many of these men had grown up in the same Medellín barrios, playing soccer barefoot in the streets long before they became soldiers in the most powerful cartel on earth.
Old enough for cocaine to have made him one of the richest men in the world, rich and ruthless enough.
But by late 1993, loyalty had become a fragile illusion. Under relentless pressure from Los Pepes and Colombia's elite search bloc, cracks began to form. Fear crept in. Greed whispered in dark corners. And slowly, the empire Pablo built wasn't torn apart by enemies storming the gates. It was eaten alive from the inside. Declassified files years later confirmed what Escobar himself had suspected. Some of his most trusted men were secretly working with his enemies. Los Pepes and the search bloc didn't just rely on brute force. They bought information. And in a war as bloody and chaotic as this, intel was worth its weight in gold. Why did these betrayals happen? The motivations were messy and deeply personal. Fear was at the top of everyone's list, and so was money. Los Pepes made sure everyone knew what happened to those who stayed loyal to Escobar. Witnessing friends tortured and mutilated was a powerful motivator to switch sides. Some also saw the writing on the wall. With Escobar's empire collapsing, taking a payout from Los Pepes or the government seemed like a safer bet than dying for a doomed cause. Well, not everyone adored Pablo, even people within his inner circle. Many resented his paranoia and the casual way he ordered executions, even of longtime allies. Little by little, Escobar's once ironclad inner circle began to fray.
Hunting for Pablo Escobar, the billionaire cocaine trafficker who killed anyone who opposed him.
The Medellín cartel and the Cali cartel were originally strategic partners in the cocaine trade, but became arch-enemies around 1998 due to a dispute over distribution territories. The Cali cartel leadership, including brothers Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela and Helmer Herrera, directly contributed to the downfall of Escobar and the Medellín cartel. But the list is so long that no one person or organization can take the entire credit. One of Escobar's most dangerous vulnerabilities also came from the men meant to shield him, his bodyguards. These weren't random thugs. They were handpicked for their loyalty and skill, entrusted with the cartel's deepest secrets, safe house locations, escape routes, even the exact timing of Pablo's movements. But loyalty bought with fear and money is fragile. Under the intense psychological warfare waged by Los Pepes, some bodyguards cracked. Evidence later revealed that a few began secretly feeding safe house locations to the search bloc, allowing Los Pepes and government forces to launch pinpoint raids. This betrayal became painfully clear after Escobar's dramatic escape from La Catedral, his self-designed luxury prison, in 1992. After his escape, Pablo relied on a rotating network of hideouts to stay one step ahead. Yet somehow, every move he made was anticipated. Each new safe house was either destroyed or ambushed. It was as if Los Pepes were reading his mind, when in reality, they were simply reading reports from his own men. Each time Escobar narrowly escaped, the walls closed in tighter. Paranoia consumed him. He began switching plans at the last second, moving his family without warning, and even doubling back on routes to test for leaks. The result was chaos. A man once feared for his strategic brilliance now running in circles, second-guessing everyone and everything. Here's the chilling part. Escobar's downfall wasn't luck on his enemy's part. It was calculated betrayal, woven like a thread through every move Los Pepes and the search block made. A tip about a safe house here, an intercepted message there. Individually, these seemed small, but together, they created a deadly map of Escobar's world. His enemies anticipated his every move, dismantling his empire step by step, like chess masters playing a game where Pablo didn't even know the rules anymore. By the time he realized the scale of the betrayal, it was too late. The Medellín cartel wasn't collapsing under external attack. It was crumbling from within.
He'd been shot repeatedly by troops who had surrounded the two-story house.
As 1993 dragged on, Escobar's paranoia reached its peak. He began cutting off communication, even with family, terrified that any conversation could expose him. His calls to his wife, Maria Victoria, were brief and erratic. Even his son, Juan Pablo, was left in the dark about their locations and plans. Former allies like John Jairo Velázquez Vázquez, better known as Popeye, later described this period as the slow death of the Medellín cartel. Soldiers deserted, lieutenants defected, entire factions switched sides. Pablo's once vast network shrank to a handful of men he hoped he could trust. By December 1993, Escobar was reduced to hiding in a rundown Medellín safe house with just one loyal companion, his bodyguard Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, nicknamed El Limón. It was the ultimate irony. The man who once commanded thousands now relied on a single ally to watch his back. Years later, Popeye, Escobar's top hitman and one of the last surviving members of the Medellín cartel, broke his silence in interviews and documentaries. His accounts painted a harrowing picture of Pablo's final days. He trusted no one, Popeye recalled. Every day he was more paranoid. He wouldn't sleep. He'd move at 3 in the morning, then again at 6. We were exhausted, but he was terrified Los Pepes would find his family. Popeye revealed that Escobar became obsessed with listening in on police radio chatter, convinced it was the only way to stay ahead. He would sit for hours with a crude receiver, muttering to himself while chain-smoking cigarettes, his nerves fraying more with each passing night. The Pablo who once ruled Medellín was gone, Popeye said. By the end, he wasn't a king anymore. He was a man running from ghosts. For a man who built his empire on loyalty and fear, Escobar's undoing was tragically poetic. By the final days of his life, Escobar was a man hunted by ghosts he couldn't see. The rooftop shootout, or execution. Pablo Escobar's story was always larger than life. From a street hustler selling fake lottery tickets in Medellín to the billionaire kingpin who flooded the United States with cocaine, his life was a dizzying climb through crime, politics, and violence.
Old enough for cocaine to have made him one of the richest men in the world, rich and ruthless enough to have hundreds of people who got in his way killed.
By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar was a shadow power in Colombia, bribing politicians, assassinating judges, and waging a bloody war against anyone who dared challenge him.
Hundreds of civilians, police, judges, and government officials were killed.
Well, on December 2nd, 1993, Pablo Escobar's bloody reign came to an end, or so the official story goes. Pablo Escobar's empire had crumbled, leaving him trapped in a handful of decaying safe houses with only a shrinking circle of loyalists by his side. The once mighty Medellín cartel he ruled like a king had all but vanished, while his rivals in the Cali cartel joined forces with Los Pepes to dismantle him piece by piece. Even some of his closest allies had turned on him, secretly feeding intel to the elite search block unit created to hunt him down. Still, Escobar had no intention of going quietly. Despite his paranoia, he still had one dangerous weakness: his family. On the day before his death, his 44th birthday, Pablo placed an unusually long phone call to his son, Juan Pablo, trying to reassure him and his wife, Maria Victoria, that they would soon be safe. What he didn't know was that both the Colombian government and Los Pepes were listening in. That single phone call gave away his location, setting the final hunt in motion.
Authorities had traced a phone call Escobar had made on Monday to a radio station complaining about the treatment of his family.
The next afternoon, search block descended on a modest row house in Medellín. It was almost poetic. Pablo, once the most feared man in Colombia, hiding in plain sight in the same city where his empire was born. Inside the house, Pablo and his lone bodyguard, Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, better known as El Limón, realized too late that they were surrounded. Limón bolted for the window first, dropping to a lower roof as gunfire erupted. He didn't make it far. He was hit multiple times before collapsing in the street below. Pablo Escobar followed, climbing out onto the terracotta rooftop in a desperate bid to escape. Armed with 2 pistols, including the very Sig Sauer 9mm he'd once theatrically surrendered to authorities, he returned fire as bullets whizzed past. Witnesses reported hearing a chaotic barrage of gunfire, lasting only seconds, then silence. When the smoke cleared, Pablo Escobar lay dead.
Yes, Pablo Escobar is dead. He was killed today by the special brigade.
His massive frame sprawled across the tiles, 3 bullet wounds marking his body. One in his leg, one in his upper back, and a final shot through his right ear, the one that killed him instantly. The rooftop shootout had ended, but something dark lingered. The official story was simple. Search Block cornered Pablo Escobar, engaged in a firefight, and took him down in a heroic moment of justice. Colombian President Cesar Gaviria even held a press conference praising the victory. But almost immediately, cracks in the narrative began to show. Witnesses in the neighborhood swore they saw unidentified men leaving the scene before police declared it secure. Photographs of Pablo Escobar's corpse, first snapped by DEA agent Steve Murphy, looked strangely staged. His body positioned in a way some claimed didn't match how a man would fall naturally. Most suspicious of all, Los Pepes operatives were rumored to have been operating in the same area, possibly arriving before Search Block stormed the house. Had the Colombian government really brought down Escobar, or had someone else beaten them to it and staged a scene to hide the truth? There was also another darker theory. Pablo Escobar killed himself. Mark Bowden's best-selling book, Killing Pablo, raised the possibility that the final, fatal bullet didn't come from Search Block at all. Instead, Pablo, cornered and unwilling to be paraded through the streets like a trophy, may have pressed his pistol to his own ear and pulled the trigger. There's eerie evidence supporting this theory. The autopsy revealed no gunshot residue around the ear wound, something that could happen if the barrel had been pressed directly against his skin. Even stranger, Pablo Escobar's bodyguard Limon was also found with a precisely placed bullet wound to the forehead, almost like a coup de grace. Some members of Pablo Escobar's family insist this is exactly what happened. Juan Pablo Escobar once said, "My father always told us that if he was ever cornered, he would take his own life before letting them capture him alive." But there's a third, even more chilling possibility that Pablo Escobar was executed after capture. According to declassified reports, Los Pepes had a strong presence near the scene. Some believe they reached Pablo first, captured him alive, and then silenced him forever. The motive? To prevent him from cutting deals or revealing the shadowy alliances between Los Pepes, the Colombian government, and even United States intelligence agencies. Supporters of this theory point to the chaotic aftermath. The crime scene was immediately swarmed by police, military, and civilians, contaminating key evidence. The official autopsy also came with a press release attached, unusually eager to dismiss the possibility of suicide, almost as if they were controlling the narrative. Several Search Block officers would later admit off-record that they weren't sure who fired the fatal shot. But even Pablo Escobar's death didn't close the chapter on Los Pepes. It only deepened the mystery. The cover-up. Erasing Los Pepes' crimes. When Pablo Escobar's bloody empire finally crumbled on that Medellín rooftop, the world cheered.
Authorities say Escobar and another man first tried to scramble away across the rooftops, then began shooting at police.
News outlets plastered his limp body across their front pages, politicians delivered victory speeches, and Colombia celebrated what seemed like a final triumph over chaos.
In recent years, as he ran from the police and other traffickers who also tried to kill him, Escobar's power had begun to wane.
But behind the headlines, a far murkier story was unfolding. The truth about who really brought Pablo down, and the brutal methods they used, was quickly swept under the rug. The official narrative focused entirely on the Search Block, Colombia's elite anti-narcotics police unit. They were painted as heroic warriors who risked everything to bring down the world's most dangerous criminal. The vigilante group known as Los Pepes practically erased from the story, their name mentioned only in whispers. It wasn't just an omission, it was a deliberate cover-up. In the weeks following Pablo Escobar's death, Colombia's government moved fast to control the narrative. Press conferences hailed the Search Block as saviors. Streets were named after fallen police officers. Meanwhile, the mutilated bodies and bombed-out buildings left behind by Los Pepes were simply ignored. Official reports described them as collateral violence or the work of unnamed gangs. To acknowledge Los Pepes' role would mean admitting an uncomfortable truth, that the Colombian state and its foreign allies had collaborated with a death squad that used terror tactics just as savage as Pablo Escobar's. And so, Los Pepes weren't punished. They were absorbed. Many of its core members, including the notorious Castaño brothers, seamlessly transitioned into the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, a massive paramilitary organization that would dominate Colombian politics and rural life for the next decade. Pablo Escobar's body was left on a rooftop, photographed and paraded as proof of victory. But what truly happened that day, and in the shadowy years before it, remains murky. Many former members of Los Pepes didn't just melt back into society, they built empires of their own. The AUC, which absorbed much of Los Pepes' leadership, became one of the most powerful paramilitary forces in Latin America, controlling cocaine routes, assassinating activists, and even influencing elections.
U.S. drug agents said it also was good for the United States, where he faced numerous charges.
When the AUC was officially disbanded in 2006, its pieces didn't vanish. They splintered into new criminal groups. The most infamous of these is the Gulf Clan, Colombia's most powerful modern cartel led by figures who trace their roots back to paramilitary groups, and by extension, Los Pepes. The Gulf Clan now operates with the same brutal efficiency: murder, extortion, and territorial control through terror. This is perhaps the cruelest twist. Pablo Escobar's story was turned into entertainment, while the darker forces behind his fall continue to operate in the shadows, shaping politics, economics, and everyday life. History told us Pablo Escobar died on a rooftop, but the declassified truth shows he died long before that, hunted, betrayed, and broken by a shadow army that left scars Colombia may never heal from. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.